Your hair is glowing in the sun, your hand in mine so warmly bound. It's bright outside and bright inside. Mid-afternoon, minister, we're free to wander anywhere. No more hatred in the stairs. Everyone's busy, minds their own, so it's just me and you and no serious. Not long ago, the dog. Hello, everyone. Hello, brothers and sisters around the world. Welcome to the second episode of the Late Saints blog, or vlog, as we like to call it. And today is a very busy appointment. Yesterday, we did the introduction with the general guidelines of what I'm going to talk about and deal with on this channel. And today, we're just going to dive right into it because there's a lot to talk about. As you saw from the title, probably, today's episode is going to be about Ukraine. Ukraine is a very, very delicate button lately. And, from all the usual shenanigans and the humdrum on the media, it looks like we're headed for a confrontation between Russia and the United States, even though the reasons of these confrontations are quite obscure, at least like if you follow the official narrative and then don't go past the fact that Russia is bad and they want to invade Ukraine. Why? Nobody knows. So today we're going to try and decode what has been the crux of the matter in the past probably 10, 12 years. And we'll have to rewind all the way back to the Second World War. So I prepared a few slides and I prepared a little bit of review on Wikipedia so that we can go all get on up to speed on what's going on, where is Ukraine, why is it so important, why is it getting caught in the crossfire between uh, the NATO bloc headed by the United States and the Russian Federation. Um, the reasons are multiple. There are many, many layers involved in this and in many episodes and many reason and layers involved in this process. And there are economic reasons, military reasons, and geopolitical and yeah, I would say geopolitical reasons as well. So multi-layered uh, chess game that, as usual, is kind of like simplified to the extreme to the point of not being understandable anymore or recognizable anymore to the medium average listener. Most of the people don't even know where Ukraine is. But let's not get um, uh, diverted too much before even starting. Our approach is very clear. We're gonna lay it all out for you guys to look at and think about it, and then we'll draw our conclusions. But most important is like we all know what we're talking about, because otherwise, like we are left at the whim of the mainstream media and the general press, and there is a lot of disinformation that is aimed at facilitating a confrontation, facilitating arms investments, facilitating diverting a lot of funds toward that direction, with the usual culprits raking in all the benefits and the populations getting crushed as usual in the process. So I think I want to start with the Wikipedia thing, and we're gonna just go quickly over where is Ukraine, what is it, why is it so relevant, and what happened. So I'm just gonna read along with you guys. I read through this. I just wanted to have like some basic facts so we would understand. Um, so Ukraine is on the western border of Russia, kind of central western border of Russia. We'll see much more clearly later with the slides where it is exactly. But it is a very, very colorful and very, very interesting history marked by great achievements, cultural and societal, and then also like great tragedies of civil war. So we are gonna jump into the World War II start point, after the Ukraine and Russia were involved in the Russian civil war that cost millions of lives in between the 20s and the 40s. So it says here, following the invasion of Poland in September 39, Nazi Germany and the Soviet troops divided the territory of Poland. Poland was split in two parts. From previous history, Poland had kind of like nationalized or incorporated a part of Ukraine. In second, after the invasion of the Russian, after the invasion of the Nazis of Ukraine, Ukraine was able to reclaim the historical portion of its own territory. Uh, it got set up in that way. What is very interesting here is when the Germany decided to invade Russia in 1941, June 22, 1941. That was kind of like funny because Hitler said at the time he had signed up a treaty of non-belligerence with Russia, and then which means like they wouldn't attack each other. And when he decided to attack Russia, he said like treaties are just pieces of paper and can be ripped down, and he ripped off, and then he proceeded to destroy the treaty and then move on. This reminds me very, you know, clearly of another president in the United States that just completely disregarded another treaty, but that's another story for another podcast. So we're gonna leave it at that. So this is interesting. In 41, the Nazis attacked Russia, and they advanced very very quickly. They made it all the way to Kiev, the capital of Ukraine. Resisted for a long time. Uh, and then there was an interesting phenomenon that there was two movements, the UPA and the OUN, were two nationalist movements that sided with the Nazis and actually were enlisted in the Nazi army. And in the meantime, while the Nazi took over Ukraine and moved on towards Moscow, these separatist militias exterminated about 100,000 Polish civilians and trying to ethnically cleanse Ukraine from all the Polish elements and trying to reestablish an Ukrainian nationality concept that was free of anybody external being in their country. In total, keeping like a war keeps going. In total, the number of ethnic Ukrainians who fought in the ranks of the Soviet army is estimated to be 4.5 million to 7 million. The pro-Soviet partisan guerrilla resistance in Ukraine is estimated to number at 47,000. Um, the number of the insurgent army were unreliable, blah blah blah. And when the war is over, Ukraine flows back into the Soviet Union at the time, and the republic was very heavily damaged by the war, required significant efforts to recover, like all the rest of Europe that was flattened. More 700 cities and towns and 28,000 villages were destroyed. The situation was worsened by famine and post-war ethnic cleansing occurred in the newly expanded Soviet Union. As of January 1953, Ukrainians were second only to Russians among adult special deportees, comprising 20% of the total. In addition, 450,000 ethnic Germans from Ukraine and more than 200,000 Crimean Tatars were victims of forced deportation. So, after the Second World War, the Soviet Union purged, with Stalin, purged the Soviet Union to a lot of elements that were deported to Siberia and everything else. At the death of Stalin, Nikita Khrushchev became president. He had been managing Ukraine from 1938 to 1941, was familiar with the republic. And the relationship between Ukraine and Russia improved notably, and Crimea was transferred back from the Russian SFSR to the Ukrainian SSR. 1950, the Republic had fully surpassed pre-war levels of industry and production. They had like a great growth in the 50s and the 60s, and then became like center of the Soviet arms industry and high-tech research. Such important role resulted in a major influence in the local elite, blah blah blah. And then it keeps going until 1986 when we had like the Chernobyl nuclear power plant explosion that resulted in the disaster. Okay, so this is when it gets interesting. In 1989, the Berlin Wall, the Soviet Union collapses. The Berlin Wall starts being dismantled, and so the Ukrainians become independent. In August 1991, um, they were leaning pro-Russia, but then in 1991 there was an attempt against the life of Mikhail Gorbachev, and then when it failed, the Ukrainian parliament adopted the Act of Independence. It keeps going, blah blah blah. Is a great economic growth. It becomes like a strong force of the European production. And until this is all good until in 2004, this is when things get sketchy, and this is when it gets interesting, because this is where the US starts coming into play. In 2004, there was a color orange revolution. It was the first attempt of one of those color revolutions orchestrated usually by the Western powers to subvert and or at least um, involve certain kind of nations that were pivotal to their expansion into their own orbit of influence. So in 2004 is the Orange Revolution. Viktor Yanukovych, then prime minister, was declared the winner of the presidential elections, which had been largely rigged. This is Wikipedia. This is where we're gonna start drifting into when things get rearranged to fit a certain narrative. As the Supreme Court of Ukraine later ruled, the results caused a public outcry in support of the opposition candidate, Viktor Yushchenko, who challenged the outcome. During the tumultuous months of the revolution, candidate Yushchenko suddenly became gravely ill and was soon found by multiple independent physicians groups to have been poisoned by TCDD dioxin. Yushchenko strongly suspected Russian involvement in his poisoning, uh, again, not proven. All this eventually resulted in the peaceful Orange Revolution, bringing Viktor Yushchenko and Yulia Tymoshenko to power while casting Viktor Yanukovych in opposition. Okay, this is interesting because Wikipedia makes a point of adding the activists of the Orange Revolution were funded and trained in tactics of political organization and nonviolent resistance, and this is all to be seen by Western pollsters. I don't know what that means, and professional consultants. It's not clarified. Were partly funded by Western government and non-government agencies, but received most of their funding from domestic sources. This again. According to The Guardian, the foreign donors included the US State Department and USAID, along with the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs, the International Republican Institute, the NGO Freedom House, and George Soros Open Society Institute. George Soros is always like giving money to whatever, right? Like he's always in the mix for some reason. Then they say, wow, he's the object of conspiracy theories. The National Endowment for Democracy has supported democracy building efforts in Ukraine since 1988, right before the Soviet Union fell. Writings of Nonviolent Struggle by Gene Sharp contributed in the forming of strategic basis of the student campaigns. Okay, so in 2004, let's say with the help and the influence and the organization of the West, Ukraine does Orange Revolution, one of those color revolutions that are oftentimes coups, camouflage coups. So basically shifts towards the West. Yanukovych returned in power in 2006 as prime minister, and then amid the financial crisis, the Ukrainian economy plunged by 15%. And then that's when it gets even more interesting. Yanukovych was elected again president in 2010 with 48% of the votes. All of a sudden, in 2014, we have another revolution called the Euromaidan protest, started in November 2013 after the president, Viktor Yanukovych, began moving away from an association agreement that had been in the works with the European Union and instead chose to establish closer ties with the Russian Federation. Now, once we'll go through the slides, you'll understand why. Ukraine is like right on the border of Russia, as great resources in terms of like natural gases and everything, has been providing, has been the main um, uh, gas line to Europe. And of course, it needs to mediate between Europe and the Russian Federation. It couldn't be otherwise. So a position of complete opposition to the Russian Federation would be suicidal, considering the location and then the necessity that Ukraine has to benefit or commerce from Europe, but also the Russian Federation. So it would be in their interest to serve the interests of both and then reap the benefits of both. Some Ukrainians took to the streets to show their support for closer ties with Europe. Meanwhile, in the predominantly Russian speaking East, a large portion of the population opposed the Euromaidan protests, instead supporting the Yanukovych government. Over time, Euromaidan came to describe a wave of demonstration and civil unrest in Ukraine, the scope of which evolved to include calls for the resignation of President Yanukovych and his government. So, violence escalated after 16 January 2014 when the government accepted new anti protest laws. Violent anti government demonstrators occupied buildings in the center of Kiev, including the Justice Ministry building, and riots left 98 dead, with approximately 15,000 injured and 100 considered missing, from 18 to 20 of February. On 21 February, President Yanukovych signed a compromise deal with opposition leaders that promised constitutional changes to restore certain powers to parliament and called for early elections to be held by December. However, members of parliament voted on February 22 to remove the president and set an election for May 25th to select his replacement. Petro Poroshenko, running on a pro European Union platform, won with over 50% of the vote, therefore not requiring a runoff election. Upon his election, Poroshenko announced that his immediate priorities would be to take action in the civil unrest in eastern Ukraine and mend ties with the Russian Federation. Poroshenko was inaugurated as president on June 7, 2014, as previously announced. This devolves in a. This is when Wikipedia cannot be trusted anymore, because now it goes into describing what happened in Crimea, um, and it's not necessarily what is described, because Crimea, let's open a little parenthesis. Crimea is to Russia as Guam or Hawaii or any other offshore military base is to the United States. So Crimea has hosted the port, like a port where the Russian Navy has been stationed since the 1700s in one way or another, and the drift of this new revolution of 2014, new coup in which the government was deposed and another government, pro-European government, was installed in its place, of course, concerned Russia, because Russia didn't want absolutely to lose its access to the sea. Um, and so it was an inevitable choice for Russia to preserve. It's like if somebody had conquered and encircled a port, or Guam or Hawaii, and the U.S. would run the risk to be cut off from access to its navy and its ocean outlet in that area. The U.S. would immediately intervene and take over. So that's what Russia did to protect its access to the sea and its access to navigation from there. And that's exactly why in a way, like, Ukraine has become this crux where NATO is trying to lure Ukraine into the orbit of NATO in order to oppose and block and finish encircling Russia. We'll see more in the slides. Russia is strongly opposing that. So what happened was that Russia sent undercover military that basically took over Crimea without shooting a shot, and then did a snap referendum in which 98% of the people voted to be annexed to Russia. So Crimea became part of Russia. Crimea is this little tiny appendix to Ukraine. And then in the meantime, in the separate region of Donetsk and Luhansk, Armen declaring themselves as local militia supported pro-Russian protesters, seized government buildings, and basically de facto took over those two regions in which there was a vast majority of Russian speakers. So what happened during the Stalin years and during the following the Soviet years, a lot of Russians uh, were concentrated in these areas that were Ukraine, but in order to create a buffer zone with Russia. Those areas are Russian-speaking areas which have sought independence, and they were totally fine with autonomy role in the state. Of course, when this change of event and then the repression that came from the central government threatened their existence. It became an armed confrontation with the army that was trying to invade this area and restore control. Then it became like a full-on insurgents. And also, we don't have to forget that this is not mentioned anywhere here in Wikipedia, but the latest 2014 and after drift and new coup in which Victoria Nuland, which by the way is responsible, I don't remember what her position is in the Biden government, and is one of the main advocate of escalation in Ukraine. Victoria Nuland was severely involved in facilitating this coup, and also they took advantage of the strength of the neo-Nazi Ukrainian neo-Nazis that are that are putting pressure on the Yanukovych government. So right now we have, like, the United States always fomenting disorder, trying to lure the Ukraine into its own orbit, and then Russia having to deal with this on their own border. It's like if this situation was happening in Mexico and Russia was fomenting coups and disorder and arming these regions right on the border of the United States, it would be serious problems. So, without staying on this one much longer, we're gonna go back and we're gonna talk a little bit about what's happening right now. So the situation has escalated since 2014. The situation has been very, very tense because the government and the separatists in the eastern regions on the border with Russia have been at each other's throats. Russia has supported the separatists as Russian speakers. Putin, I don't like to call people like because of Russia, but let's say Putin is interested in protecting them and avoiding ethnic cleansing and a bloodbath of Russian speaking, Russian, ethnically Russian um, citizens in Ukraine. Ukraine is like it doesn't want to lose control of that part of the population, has been egged on by the United States, which have been since then uh, giving hundreds of millions of dollars for weapons. Because what we normally do, we as the United States, we like to flood countries with weapons, and then start trouble first and think about the consequences later, especially because the consequences usually don't affect us directly. So it doesn't really matter if hundreds of thousands of people die in the process of these geopolitical shenanigans that are created. um, in this moment, everybody's been trying to reach an agreement, and then we're gonna see why Russia has drawn a red line in Ukraine. For this, we're gonna follow the slideshow that I prepared. So here we have like this is the situation um, after the Second World War. As you can see, this is the Soviet Union. This was the Eastern Bloc. There was this nice line that divided the Western Bloc from the Eastern Bloc, and the lines were pretty defined. There was the Berlin Wall that separated, uh, East Germany from West Germany. The situation was pretty static. Okay, then I found this beautiful map that shows us what happens. This is 1949, what you just saw. In 1952, Greece and Turkey get added to NATO. 55, West Germany gets added to NATO. In 1892, Spain gets added to NATO. And then the eastward in 1999, Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland. 2004, Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Romania. 2009, Croatia and Albania. And in 2006, Montenegro. Okay, so now um, what's happening right now? This is where we're at. So this is Russia. The red one marking red. This is Azerbaijan near Turkey. Another theater of shenanigans last summer. This is Ukraine. Okay, as you can see, this is the little tiny island, this Crimea, that now has become part of Russia. And then this is Ukraine. So Ukraine is as far as NATO can push before being in Russia. NATO has been trying to include uh, Ukraine into its own alliance. So, and maybe a separate discussion can be started about the role of NATO. There was a military alliance created to fight and counteract the Soviet Union. It should have been disbanded or dismantled in 1989 when the Soviet Union collapsed and all the states became um, independent, the satellite states, and slowly got included into Europe. Russia is not opposing the inclusion of these states into a wider European community. Russia is just opposing including these states into a military alliance that is going to place missiles and offensive capabilities right on the doorstep of Russia. This has been a request in 1989. Apparently, there was an agreement between the Gorbachev and then the president, the leader of NATO at the time, that NATO wouldn't extend eastward, and NATO, as NATO as always does, never keeps its promises and keeps ramping up, uh, you know, the states and the militarizations of these states closer and closer to Russia. So it is inevitable that at some point they would bump into some pushback. There was a similar situation in Georgia where Russia had set down a red line. NATO fomented like a color revolution there, and it ended up in a bloodbath. So there was already Georgia, if I'm not mistaken, is right here. Um, so right now the situation in Ukraine is very tense for this reason because the United States has poured hundreds of millions of dollars into it for sending political advice, military advisors, armaments, and everything, and start amping up the capabilities of Ukraine. Ukrainian's government, under the pressure of the neo-Nazi and Yushchenko, is Zelensky, sorry, now the president is Zelensky, is pro-Western, and so they're making it look like they really need to become part of NATO to be protected by Russia. And the narrative has always been that Russia wants to invade Ukraine. That is not true at all. Russia was totally fine with being Ukraine independent and united. So they brokered a deal between the separatists and Ukraine. They brought them to the table and said that they had to agree that the East would be remain part of Ukraine, as the Russian natives there want to be part of Ukraine, but want to be autonomous. And then the central government would recognize their autonomy and guarantee their safety. These agreements have not been implemented, and the government refuses to implement these agreements. So Russia is under this pressure of protecting its own citizens and having NATO that wants to expand eastward one more time as close as possible to the borders of Russia. So they set up a red line in Ukraine. It said like Ukraine cannot be part of NATO, and as you reneged on your promises made at the time in informal agreements, we need written agreements that NATO won't expand 1 inch eastward. Let's not forget that NATO is a military alliance. Russia is not again contesting the fact of like these countries being included in Europe and economically developing, is contesting the fact that we need to place our missiles at their border and talk about defensive capabilities when we are the ones that are pushing eastward. Russia is not pushing towards the United States. We are thousands and thousands of miles away from the United States. So there is no business here being there and arming these regions. So this is another map of what the 2015 NATO countries and where Russia is. This is again Ukraine. And this is what the map of Ukraine. As I say, Crimea has been annexed to Russia, so now it's part of Russia. And these are the two regions in question, Donetsk and Luhansk, that are pretty much almost like a dent inside of Russia, and the rest is Ukraine. So what is happening right now is uh, the U.S. has been ramping up this rhetoric that Russia is going to invade Ukraine. Russia won't invade Ukraine in the sense of the entirety of Ukraine. If the United States refuse to accept their red line of not adding Ukraine to the NATO alliance, which has been pretty clear, stated pretty clearly by Blinken, even today at a press conference after the seventh meeting with Lavrov, the foreign ministers, Russia's foreign ministers. He said that the United States cannot give guarantees in this sense. They're gonna keep expanding. It's a free world. Everybody can become part of everyone. And then, so if Ukraine decides to be part of NATO, so be it. Stoltenberg says the general in command of NATO said the same thing. He's been amping up the rhetoric against Russia, and so it seems like their red lines is like, okay, we hear you, but as usual, we don't care about what your priorities are, which are not even that. Uh, their requests are not even that crazy. Russia is simply saying Ukraine is a no-go zone for militarization of the West. Period. It's as simple. It's very simple position. It doesn't have anything to do all the fear mongering done with the Russian troops, hundreds of thousands of troops around Ukraine ready to invade. Russia will never invade the entirety of Ukraine. There is no point in doing that. It would be like trying to do a new Afghanistan all over again. So it's like Ukraine is a strong pride, is a very, very strongly nationalist country. The only thing that Russia will probably do at this point will be invade Luhansk and Donetsk, which is not even invading, will be welcomed as liberators at this point and set a firmer border and then brace for confrontation with the United States. Despite the rhetoric, yesterday, 2 days ago, Biden said that he would be fine with a small invasion. I think he was referring if Russia took those two regions, there wouldn't be any sanctions. So the threat of sanctions, unilateral sanctions, and military action um, is always on the table for the United States. That's the first and foremost way to go, despite the fact of the contrary. They have already sent hundreds of millions of dollars of weapons along with the UK, and now they authorized 2 days ago. The State Department has given the go ahead for three NATO allies to rush anti armor missiles and other US made weapons to Ukraine, a sign of renewed urgency among Western allies over the threat of a multi front invasion by Russian forces. The requests from Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania were received in recent weeks, and the last of the three was approved Wednesday after being received the night before, according to an administration official who spoke on condition of anonymity uh, to discuss an issue that hasn't been announced. Everything that we hear from the United States is always like by unnamed officials. Nobody ever takes any position, so nobody's ever liable, or nobody can be persecuted for whatever has been done. It's always like all these things always happen in the cloud. The Biden administration will also begin the process of shipping $200 million worth of anti-armor missiles, ammunition, and other equipment to Ukraine in the coming days. So this is an act of war. Like, imagine if Russia was shipping hundreds of millions of dollars of assault of heavy weapons to Mexico to foment an insurgency, to foment a state that has like some kind of like uh, national beef with the United States. That would be a declaration of war. This is a declaration of war united with the sanctions. If the U.S. does it, it's never a problem. We can basically arm and then foment as much devastation as possible. We are never accountable for anything. We've seen this method happening in many, many countries. It's been after the 2004 Orange Revolution in Ukraine. We've seen it happening everywhere. Like, we saw it in Syria, in Libya, and then same thing, like Iraq was invaded under false pretenses, and then South America in other places, and it's always the same thing. There is a legitimate protest of the population regarding certain kind of issues. The U.S. and the NGOs, the American NGOs, intervene, militarize the conflict, create a coup, install a puppet that is pro-Western, and then from there on keep pushing their agenda. They tried to do the same thing in Kazakhstan. This time, uh, the thing was foreseen by the Russians. The Russian intervened with a peacekeeping force. They established order within 2 days. They left within 5 days. So there was like, they were expecting this. It was a diversion. They were trying to kind of like bog down the Russians on multiple fronts. It failed. They were prepared. They cleansed um, Western funded destabilizing elements, and then got out of there and got ready back to go to Ukraine. Under export control regulation, the three countries were required to obtain approval from the State Department before transferring their weapons to Ukraine. The administration official declined to list the specific weapons that were approved for transfer, etc., etc. So, just to give you an idea of what we're talking about here, is this is a outdated map. It's from 2014. In 2014, the United States spends on military $680 billion a year, which is like the next 15 countries together. So from these staggering numbers, that this is money that keeps growing and ballooning. There is trillions of it have been unaccounted for. There was just an investigation that was completely squashed, by which like a insane amount of money in the trillions of dollars was not traced or traceable that had been given to the Pentagon. So right now, this was 2014. Now it's 2021. We are at 780 billion. So it went up to 100 billion. It was upped by Obama in the last 2 years of his presidency. It was definitely upped by Trump, and then to 700 billion, I believe. And then when Biden took office, within a year, we're talking about 780 billions. It was 760, and then they decided to toss another 20 billion. So this is a criminal misuse of American taxpayer money that is used to fund insurrection and continue a sense of domination based only on military power and military projection. Let's look here. This is the map of American bases around the world. So as you can see, it's pretty clear to see who's invading who's aggressing who's surrounding who, right? So this is Russia, this is China. Look at this, look at that. So there is no, these are facts. So when you listen to the rhetoric and the propaganda coming from the American government, you just need to check who's where. I don't see any Russian bases here. So now Russia is saying that they're gonna help. They had Cuba in the 60s. We all saw how that panned out, right? When they wanted to put missiles in Cuba, we almost got to the third World War and nuclear annihilation. So right now, as America is projecting its power, is projecting its military um domination all around the two nations or the two superpowers that he considered um, enemies, because for some reason we all have to consider each other enemies. Um, and while this seems naive right now, like there's plenty of resources and plenty of things to keep the things flowing and everybody making money as they're making. So like it is like this. It's there's a lot of emotionality. There is a lot of like childishness. There is a lot of hubris for the world domination, and the ones that are pushing military action, that have been pushing military action for the past 30 years relentlessly, is NATO and the United States. The level of destruction leveled against the Middle East and Eastern nations has left staggering consequences. We're still in a bunch of conflicts that we have no place being in. We'll talk about Syria and Libya in other episodes. But all this to say, I just wanted to provide a little bit of facts and a little bit of history to put the things in context. Because right now, if we listen to the mainstream media, Russia is the evil empire, and they just want to destroy Ukraine just because they want to invade Ukraine just because they are like there are no reasons. They're just evil. If I have to say one of the few really strange things that I've witnessed and I had to suffer through when I transferred to the United States, when I moved to the United States now 16 years ago, has been this um, disturbing tendency of depicting everyone that is you know, an opposing force, or like I said, an antagonist or another nation as evil. This is a very peculiar American thing. I think it has something to do with the Christian fundamentalist idea of good and evil, and for some reason, uh, this doesn't this patriotic uh, jingoism mixed in with the religious drift makes us think that we are the good guys and everybody else is the devil and is the enemy. That's how we describe everybody, from North Korea to Russia to Iran to China to whatever, whoever else, Syria. Everybody's always evil. The only good ones is us and Israel. So this is a very, very disturbing thing that is not common in Europe, where I come from. We have our national prides. We are aware of our own strengths and weaknesses. We do not depict everybody else as evil. So, despite the fact that the United States never experienced communism on their soil, they're still using Soviet era Cold War rhetoric and McCarthyism to justify their adventurism, international adventurism, whereas the countries that actually really experienced what it meant to be close by or under communist rule, they don't see the things in the same way. Like, even though they suffered immensely for the communist drift that took over half a century. So this is, I think it's really important to be aware of what the rhetoric and the propaganda is, where the facts are. The NATO is a military alliance that should have been dismantled in the 90s when its raison d'etre, reason to be, finished with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Right now, it's been turned into a um, machine of domination and projection of military power that is using this power basically to antagonize and exacerbate conflicts with Russia and China for no reason whatsoever. It's a machine that eats billions of dollars that could be better used here at home, where like trouble is escalating, and we have a deranged president that thinks that everything is going great and is doing a great job, as he tells himself, in typical Trumpian style. uh, he just declared that he's exceeding expectations. I don't know whose expectations, because according to the polls, he's like cruising at 30% approval rate. That is one of the worst approval rates ever of the thing. Despite that, we're gonna keep up a rhetoric up. We're not gonna listen to anybody else's red lines or necessity or reasonable international affairs matters, and we're just gonna push through with the war agenda that is sustained both by Democrats and Republicans. In this case, it seems that the Democrats are one step further into the complete derangement of even conceiving or antagonizing Russia, or entering a war with Russia, or trying to drag Russia out of the sphere of influence of China, and thinking that they can do that instead of incentivizing collaboration by incentivizing bullism and aggression. So, as I said, there's like incredible resources out there. If you want to know more, if you want a very, very lucid and clear analysis of what's happening in Ukraine, I'll put the link in post with the Gray Zone with Max Blumenthal, and then is doing a great job of describing and interviewing the people that matter. Aaron Mate is an expert on Syria. The Gray Zone is like it breaks it all down. So I oftentimes listen to them when I need some kind of more insight into the situation. I'll put the link in post. There is a specific episode about um, Ukraine where Max Blumenthal interviewed Doug McGregor. There was a senior advisor to many administrations, including the Trump administration. And then he describes what was the situation when Trump was president, and what were the options that the U.S. should pursue to de-escalate the situation and trying to accomplish something meaningful in Ukraine, rather than stoking another internecine war that will end up with hundreds of thousands of civilian dead, a country in ruin, and nothing to show for it, like it happened in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, etc., etc., etc. So thanks so much for listening. I don't know exactly what the next episode is gonna be. Always remember, like if what you hear makes your rage boil and you wanna punch around you and below, you're being manipulated. Like your rage should be always directed upward. Everything that we experience is the direct consequences of the choices of the ones that are up there and then they decide for our lives. So these people don't rule for us, are up there, put there by the oligarchy, the people that give them the money. They're always going to rule in favor of the oligarchy and against us. So try to take a deep breath and forget about all the people that you hate and forget about all the division. Try to remember what Jesus said. This is a Christian country that says, love the one near you, not your neighbor as your next door neighbor. Love the one near you like yourself. He didn't say hate the unvaccinated, hate the other people in other political spectrum, hate the people of another religion, hate the people of another color. Always keep this in mind. Unity is the key. So never hate. When somebody is making you hate, when somebody is making you divided, when somebody is beating you against somebody else, you know what kind of shenanigans are at work. Try to remember this. I started applying this principle a few months back, and then it's made me very happy ever since. So I just wanted to pass it on to you. Please subscribe if you like what you hear. Please subscribe and hit the notification button. I don't have the little fancy thing that goes like bing, but I can do it like bing. Put the little like a little bell. Press that one so that next time I go live, you'll be notified and you can watch the new video and enjoy. Have a blessed day and see you soon. Bye bye now.